if you're trying to fly over the Rocky Mountains, you're going to use a map. Now, we all know that the map isn't the territory. I mean, it's such a cliche, I'm not even going to say that again. But it's one thing, we don't want to confuse the map with the territory. So what we do with an integral map is give you the best map available right now that covers all of human possibilities. And therefore, you're going to know what the human terrain consists of, and something isn't going to jump up and bite you in the ass when you're not looking. It'll bite you in the ass when you are looking, but you'll know it's there. So if you look at a simple summary of the integral map that we use, and there are dozens of variables, but we time and time again have found that there are 5 that are really, really important. We call them quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. Those are not abstractions. Those are something that you are aware of right now in your own awareness. Every single one of the things I mentioned is something that I can point out to you right now in your own awareness. The quadrants are I, we, and it, or first person, second person, third person pronouns. You're aware of that right now in your own awareness. If I'm the person that's talking is first person, the person being spoken to is second person, and the person or thing being spoken about is third person. So right now I happen to be first person, singular, and you all are second person plural. And I like, the Southerners use you all because there's no good plural for second person. Have you noticed that? So use, plural, is kind of what it should be. Northerners say you guys, and Southerners say y'all. And that's what they're trying to get across. So you're the second person plural right now, but only because I'm speaking. In a moment, you're going to speak, then you'll be first person, I'll be second person. And we'll be talking about that really embarrassing person over there will be third person. Or the thing we're talking about could be the map, and that's the third person. So you're aware of that right now. You can feel the I in yourself. And as you look at me and feel me as a you or a thou, you can feel that. And we are attempting to reach mutual understanding. And every time you understand something I'm saying, that is the lower left quadrant. You can feel it. So, and the same is true for levels, lines, states of consciousness. I could go through and point out exactly the same thing. It's not something that you have to learn about. And once you memorize the concept, like deconstruction or something like that, then it's yours. The integral map is something that you already own. You're just going to learn some terminology to help communicate with others so we can all be on the same page. Now, every other human being, without exception, has those 5 same things going on. And if you know how to spot those, if you know they're there, then when it comes to leadership or just effective communication or skillful means or just how to relate to somebody in a way that they can hear or understand you, you're going to do much, much better if the map that you're using is integral. In work, in play, in relationships, and so on. The more your cognition is integrally informed, it becomes almost a self-operating system that goes through your own biocomputer and sets off a little red flag if you're not taking some of these things into account. If you look at the great traditions, they all agree that there are at least 4, usually 5 major states of consciousness that everybody has access to. Waking, dreaming, deep sleep are the simplest. I'm writing these just across the top as gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. The waking state, dreaming state, deep, formless sleep state. What we find is that if you take somebody at a particular stage of development, and here I'm using the simple Gene Gebser stages. So I've written archaic, magic, mythic or traditional, rational or modern, pluralistic or postmodern, and integral or higher. And again, there are several higher stages. We're not saying that integral is the very highest. But this is enough for us to work with. You can be at a traditional mythic stage. And if you experience these states, you'll interpret it in those terms. Because you only have the mind to interpret what's arising. And so we get a grid here that shows these, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 24 different types of spiritual experience that you can have. In the gross waking state, if we look at states just very briefly to show what's involved, in the waking state, for example, you might have a peak experience where you're one with everything that's arising. And that's often called nature mysticism. In the dream state, though, one of the first things you notice about the dream state, the way that Vedanta and Vajrayana define it, is there's no gross objects. There's no physical body, there's no nature, there's no Gaia. It's just a subtle realm of images and light and feelings and emotions. And that's a kind of deity mysticism, if you feel one with luminosity or light that's not merely from the physical realm. So that subtle deity mysticism is typical of a dream state peak experience. And deep formless state, a peak experience there, is classic formless mysticism, or cessation, or the vast earth sprung, the emptiness out of which everything springs. And meditative states that are just formless, like nirvi kalpa samadhi, or nirod, or nirvana, all of those NIR prefixes mean without, or not. So it means, again, just that vast formlessness with no objects arising at all. And the non-dual ever-present is that which is aware of all of these. And it's one with everything that's arising. So it's sometimes confused with nature mysticism, which it shouldn't be, because that's just oneness with gross objects. But non-dual can be one with subtle objects and causal. And so it's ever-present, 24/7, timeless noticing of everything that's arising. If you have a peak experience, as I was saying, let's say you're at the mythic stage or wave of development, and you have an experience of a subtle being of light. And you come from a culture that's Christian, you very likely interpret that as Jesus, perhaps. And because you're at an ethnocentric level of development, you will believe that unless somebody has an experience of Jesus, they can't be saved. It's a very, very common thing that happens. And so a lot of the world's religions, because they started at the ethnocentric level, again, it's not bad. I mean, we all go through it, and some Republicans never get out of it. I do not want to pick on Republicans. There's very evolved Republicans, I'm sure. We try to integrate Democrat and Republican. Let me make my official statement for the record. It's very common. It's culturally molded. If you're in China or in Southeast Asia and you have an experience of light, it might very well have 10,000 arms. It might very well be Avalokiteshvara. You're never going to find a Southern Baptist seeing 10,000 arms. I mean, it's just very, very rare. And so the ethnocentric part, though, is nobody can be saved unless they believe my God, or unless they believe my Jesus, or my Jehovah, or my Allah, or my whatever it is. That's very, very common at the ethnocentric level. So, again, but somebody you can be at the rational level of development, like Bertrand Russell was, for example, and he had experience of nature mysticism, but he interpreted it, of course, in rational terms. That's almost all you can do. I want to point out two things in this regard. One is that, I don't care what stage anybody's at, all four states are available at all 6 stages. So even a 6-month-old has access to gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual realms of reality, states of consciousness. But a 3-year-old doesn't have access to some of these higher stages. They just haven't grown or developed yet. So as a person unfolds through these stages, they're still going to have access to the states, but they're going to interpret them at the stage they're at. Most people are aware of Howard Gardner's work on what he called multiple intelligences. And the idea is that human beings have, it's at least 6 and probably close to a dozen or even 24 different capacities, different types of intelligence. So we have cognitive intelligence, we have moral intelligence, there's a musical intelligence, a mathematical intelligence, a kinesthetic or athletic, artistic, and so on. And so on the bottom there, I have cognitive, interpersonal, moral, musical. I put worldviews in, kinesthetic, and values. Those are just some of the types of capacities that we have, intelligences that we have in ourselves right now. And what we find is that most people excel in some and not in others. So some people can be very good cognitively, but they're not good at music playing, for example. But the important point is that it's what we call levels and lines, and you really can be quite highly developed in some and not very well developed in others. Sometimes that's a problem, sometimes it's not, but it really has to be taken into account. What we find is that these are the things that develop through stages. The simplest one for moral I put in the middle, which is egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, and cosmocentric. Moral development, according to both male and female researchers, Lawrence Kohlberg to Carol Gilligan, tends to go through 3 or 4 major stages of unfolding. Technically, they're called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. But what they mean is egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric. A young child starts out and a young child can have a great deal of love and feeling and warmth, but can't take the role of other until around age 7. Cognitively can't actually put themselves in the shoes of somebody else. So their moral sense tends to be centered on their own wishes and desires. A young child, for example, will mumble and think that everybody understands him. He'll hide under a pillow in plain daylight thinking now nobody can see him. This is a sort of narcissistic worldview that tends to be the first stage of a lot of these developmental sequences. And as we grow, we increasingly learn to take larger and larger views of others. And so this capacity for moral sense expands from I want what's right just for me to I want what is right for my group. It's often my family first, or then it's my tribe, or it's my nation. And incidentally, about 70% of the world's population never gets higher than that, than the ethnocentric level of development, which is one of the real problems. But if development continues, it moves into post-conventional or world-centric, and it's I want what's right for all human beings, regardless of race, color, creed, and so on. Now, obviously, it's one thing to believe those values. It's another thing to make sure that they're actually put into action in the real world, and that's a whole other issue. But it's not until people get to the post-conventional or world-centric levels of development that they can even conceive of that. So obviously what we want, if we want a better world, is not just how to introduce people into states, no matter how deep or profound, let's say even a big mind state. We want to help people get from egocentric and ethnocentric to world-centric. And so we want to look at the stage component of this as well, in individuals as well as in the culture at large. Sometimes people get a little confused and they think integral development means that all 12 or whatever of your multiple intelligences are topping out a genius in everything else you do. That doesn't happen to more than 2 or 3 people that I know. Okay. That does not happen anywhere outside of comic books. The 2 or 3 lines you're going to specialize in. And that's great. Integrally informed means you're aware of that, and you don't think, and this is the perpetual problem with presidents and CEOs or any other leader, that because you're a bloody-ass genius in this line, that you're going to be a genius in everything else you do. And that's the first thing that gets leaders into trouble, is they go way outside of their area of expertise, but they're so often used to succeeding that they don't even know how to take feedback on this stuff. So integral and integrally informed are for us pretty close to being very similar. So we want people to be integrally informed about what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and then we want them to do an assessment about it. And there are 2 types of assessment. One is your poor capacity in one intelligence crippling your job? If you're a leader and you just don't have interpersonal skills, is that catching up with you? So that's the first kind of question that you want to ask. The second is there an actual pathology in any of these lines? Because that will screw you up in any event. The shadow knows, the shadow will come and find you. So those are the 2 things we want to look for. If you are hurting yourself because you don't have one of these lines developed, then part of what you want to do with integral transformative practice is focus on that line and make it a real effort to use exercises to develop that line. And the reason we try to do that as part of an integral transformative practice is that you could just go in and spend 5 hours a day trying to develop this one line. But cross-training makes each one grow faster. So if you only have 5 hours a week to spend on developing this one line, and you actually develop 2 other lines with it, let's say meditation and weightlifting, then that other line you're trying to develop will develop higher than if you only spent the hours on that line. That's what cross-training does, and that's why we try to make it part of an integral transformative practice. And then you can make great strides in that, and there are exercises for doing that and so on. And you can you can learn not only to make what level you're at more effective, but you can move a stage or two in a relatively short amount of time. So one of the things we ask is, what's the relation between these stages of development and states that you can get into? And again, there's a simple kind of rule there. States are free, stages are earned. So you can get in an altered state, you can get in a meditative state, you can put these earphones on and get into a brain state, which we'll come back to momentarily. And you can be plunged into a whole range of states precisely because they're ever present. We have waking, dream, deep sleep, peak experiences, altered states, and so on. Most of them are available fairly quickly. What we found is that the more you are plunged into a state, an altered state, that is bigger than you are, that is, whoa, what was that you can't interpret. It can be luminous, it can be profound, it can be breathtaking, it can be, oh my God. Some people have it just looking at the Grand Canyon, some people have it making love, some people have it listening to music. People have it in meditation. Once that happens, it acts to dislodge just a little bit, your identification with whatever stage you're at. It just loosens it up a little bit because something bigger just swept through you, kind of loosened the hinges a little bit. So every altered state that's bigger than you are at the moment is a micro transformative event. Probably that's why meditation is so effective in transformation, and probably why other things haven't been scientifically demonstrated is you don't do it often enough. In other words, shamanic drumming might help, but if you only do it once a month, not going to work. Meditation usually is once or twice a day, so it's an altered state, once or twice a day, once or twice a day, once or twice a day, really kind of forcing that to happen. Now, if you look at the 4 quadrants, then what we have in the upper right quadrant is one of the ways we summarize the perspectives. It's basically the objective parts of you that science would recognize that you can see in a third-person objective stance. So it's the brain and the brainstem and the hemispheres, and the brain produces different states, physiological brain states, like alpha states, beta, theta, delta, and so on. Traditionally, the great wisdom traditions maintain that waking, dream, and deep sleep states of consciousness are correlated with gross, subtle, and causal realities. In other words, they actually are associated with some very deep phenomena in your own being. Western science has found that waking state has predominantly a type of brain state known as alpha and beta, that the dream state predominantly has theta, and deep formless sleep predominantly delta waves. So what we found is that you can take some of these brain-mind technologies, strap the little thing on your head, it can be holosync or any number of things, and induce these brain states. You can induce a theta state, and when you do that, people will often start to have dream-like reverie in the upper left quadrant. And on occasion, you can get them into deep delta states, and then they'll have an experience of vast, empty formlessness. So what happens is, indirectly, what's happening when you use some of these brain-mind technologies, and they're a little bit effective, but not a whole lot effective. There are things they don't do, and we'll come back to this. But the reason it works is when you induce these brain states in the upper right, everything in the quadrants are correlated. So you induce a similar state of consciousness in the upper left. And you experience is at a kind of a waking or a dream or deep sleep state, almost meditative state of consciousness. So you are being plunged into an altered state. And the more you're plunged into an altered state, the more it helps you move through the stages. The more it slightly accelerates your movement through the stages. No stages are skipped. We have a lot of evidence on that. But you can sort of put a few drops of oil on the old spiral and it makes it a little slipperier. There are several things they don't do. And this also very closely relates to several things that meditation doesn't do. But in particular, they're not going to get at any psychodynamic issues. because you actually have to go after shadow elements with a very specific type of technique. And if you don't, what happens is the states just kind of bypass them. And sometimes they get worse. States of consciousness are sort of making parts of you strong, and they're making your shadow stronger too. So you come out in certain ways nice and more relaxed, and in other ways that twitch is getting just a little bit bigger. It won't provide you with the context of wisdom. And that's why you have to have a cognitive interpretation that goes along with meditative states. Most of the really great contemplative traditions have, this whole notion of anti-intellectualism is a Boomeritis production. All of the great wisdom traditions emphasize intellectual understanding going hand in hand with experiential meditation. Sometimes they even give it a bigger emphasis, because intellect comes from the root word B-U-D-D-H-I, and all Buddhas are drawing on intellect in the very highest sense, meaning clarity of awareness and cognition. So that is not going to happen by just being plunged into meditative states, or just counting your breath, or just putting on a headphone. You actually have to come out and have a philosophy that helps interpret your experience. And so, or it won't stick. It just doesn't stick very well. And this is one of the hard lessons we've learned in the last 30 years from the human potential movement. You can go in, you can have the great experiential explosion. 3 weeks later, it's gone. 4 weeks after that, you're more depressed than when you went in. So, but if you hold it in an integral framework, not only do they stick, you have a way to relate it to other areas. And so we're finding that we can, in a sense, revitalize the human potential movement by putting in a larger picture and using a lot of these techniques to carry it forward. My generic statement is that, I believe every occasion, every actual event has 4 quadrants, 4 dimensions, and relationship is indelible. In other words, I think it's an intrinsic part of every occasion that's arising. And so if you're not actually in touch with the relational aspect of that moment, then you're not really in touch with the full moment. And so relationship is, in my opinion, absolutely crucial. Yes. And what you want to do is not ignore it or overemphasize it. Either way can get you in trouble. Men tend to ignore it. Women tend to overemphasize it. But that's what they do for each other. And so that's why, at least on the romantic or sexual or boy-girl relationship, I happen to think that's a fundamental unit of practice. And I think that's what Tantra is all about. And I think that's why the Tibetan tradition, the very highest icons are men and women in sexual congress. Many of those traditions maintain that actually without taking an action consort, meaning without actually going through sexual consummation with a love partner, that there are certain final transformative states of enlightenment that you cannot get into. Now, interestingly, one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, founded by Tsongkhapa, which is the one that the Dalai Lama is in, they maintain, as do most of the Tibetan schools, that there are 2 ways you can get, and only 2 ways, you can get absolute ultimate enlightenment. And one is, at the final stage of practice, you have to do tantric sexual practice. The other is, you can get it in the bardo. Tsongkhapa was so worried about misusing a sexual relationship that he chose to wait to get his enlightenment in the bardo. Now, I'm just wondering about that choice. Because I don't know if I would have that much confidence that I could pull it off with him. But I'm surely I could probably do a lot better. So it's an interesting notion that is actually part of an understanding of the traditions have. I'll tell you why I think that's an important part. And again, you don't want to pigeonhole men and women. Obviously, this conversation always has to have the preface saying that we're talking about masculine and feminine principles, and men and women have both of those to various degrees. And the same in lesbian and homosexual relationship. You sort of pick whether you're more active or receptive pole. If you look, we were talking about witnessing. If you look at the traditional descriptions of witnessing, and if you also look at sort of some of the modern research that's been done on it with people that are attuned to this, when men get into, it's easier for men to get into a state of witnessing because it's a distancing. What women tend to experience that state as more is a state of all radiating love or touch. And there's probably a whole lot of reasons for that, going back even to evolutionary psychology. And I know it's trite to say men were hunters and women were child raised, but it was true. For about 1 million years, what men, the type of knowledge that kept survival going is men are in hunting bands, they're hunting at a distance and they're watching at a distance. The advantage of third person watching at a distance is you can see holes. So it's only from a distance that you can see a forest. Okay? You can touch a tree, but you can only see a forest. So you need a distance to see holes, which is interesting. Women, on the other hand, primary job is tactile. There's an infant, and you have to know every emotional nuance of that infant if you're going to keep it alive. Is it hungry? Is it sad? Is it in pain? Is it and so on? So women have developed an exquisite emotional scale of just, they can tell 28 degrees of emotional shifts. Men can tell too. And with women, it's she wants to sleep with me or she doesn't. And they interpret most of the things women say that she wants to sleep with me. Get off me, you pig. No, she doesn't. That's about it. So that tactile, both of them have their strengths and weaknesses. Feminists are fond of saying that women have a relational mode and men have an abstract. That's only half right. Women have a tactile relational mode, but it's not holistic. So in other words, you can touch the tree, but not the forest. So men actually have a holistic but detached view, but it's holistic. Women have a relational touch view, but it's not holistic. When you're touching one tree at a time, you can't see the forest. That's the strengths and the weaknesses of men and women, and I think that really is what they bring to each other. And that's why we drive each other nuts. But it's wonderful being able to sort of understand the differences in language, because at the very least, if you can't really intrinsically feel these differences, you can at least sort of cognitively translate. So, you go, okay, she said that, which really means dictionary, all of it. But instead of, classically what tends to happen is if you think you're talking the same language or want the same things, then you really do get into trouble all the time. And the studies on this are absolutely classic. If you're working on problem solving, for example, women will get together if something's wrong, and they want to just touch, they want to talk about it. A man, if he's present, will fix it. He'll go, oh, that's a problem? Oh, okay, well, we'll just look over here and fix it. And women go, no. Because if they actually come up with a solution, then it means the conversation is over. There's no more touching. And so they're very clever studies showing that if you actually put a problem on a table that women and just women are supposed to solve, they want to discuss it for an hour or so. And if the solution actually comes up, women will subtly steer around it. Because that means the end of the party. And so men, though, they're kind of sitting there and say, oh, do that. End of discussion. What's next? Let's go out and drink, So it's classically, when you see this in the worst thing of all, it's when you're in a relationship and a problem comes up. It's, I'm not getting enough attention, or we need to do this, or why aren't we going to the movie tonight, or can't we just be here? And a man will, in 15 seconds, come up with a perfect solution to it. That is exactly the wrong thing to do. and so, we could go on and on and on. It's a comedy of errors that is just, infinite. But it's very interesting when you carry this into the transcendental, transpersonal realms. And I think it's increasingly important that this kind of understanding come to our approach to spirituality, because, frankly, most of the meditative systems were developed by men sitting and staring. And they don't move, and they stare, and that's what we're good at. Not too many systems have been developed for women who want to feel and flow and be radiant and move. So, unfortunately, you get somebody like, the only place you get that in men often is somebody like Rumi, who's homosexual. So, of course he's going to dance and flow, and that's the great thing. Even in the traditions, though, there's that understanding. If you see the traditional Tanka, I have several of them here, the Dzogchen, Samattabhadra, Samattabhadri, which represents the highest icon in all of Buddhism. It's the highest icon in Dzogchen Buddhism. And the male is represented as pure black, usually. And that means this pure emptiness, this pure unmoved witness. It doesn't have any content, we were pointing it out just a little minute ago, and everything arises in this vast black emptiness, like the vast sky at night in which stars arise. But the woman is always depicted as pure white radiant light. Because the woman, the feminine principle, the man wants to look, the feminine wants to be seen, wants to radiate, wants to shine. And so if you have spiritual traditions where the woman is forced to look and just not move, it can be very difficult for her to come to that part of her that wants to be seen, that wants to radiate, that wants to move, that wants to flow, and most of all, that wants to touch. And so when you get into some of these higher states, classically men will still want to witness, and they'll experience it as emptiness. Women experience it as love, as an actual touching everything out there. So men have this kind of mirror mind, and the feminine principle has the universe is chocolate. And it's like, you can taste it, So again, men and women have both of these, and at the ultimate, they really kind of collapse into each other. Then there's a compassionate witness. The witness touches everything that's arising. The masculine and feminine forms come together. The woman has to find some distance from her touching, or else she has no freedom. She's addicted to her relationship. And that's the classic pathology of female, is that they can't stand up. They can't have autonomy. They're lost in their relationship. And that's the downside of that. The classic male pathologies, they're not just autonomous. They're rigid, repressed, separated, can't feel. So it's way too extreme in that direction. And again, ideally what we do for each other is try to balance those. And again, we come from a period where we some of these distinctions were really rigid and stereotyped, and under those circumstances it just becomes harsh. Yeah. But we went way too far and said, okay, no differences, everything's the same, we can't have any of that at all. And that's just as violent in its own way. And we even have native understanding. I mean, men tend to be appreciated for their capacity for depth and presence, for example. Often one of the highest compliments you'll give a woman is, she came in the room and she lit up the room. There's a radiance, there's a shine that can come off the feminine. I think that's what it's always depicted as, this luminous. And so, but the whole point about that, we have both of those in us, but each moment is a moment of consciousness and light. And the consciousness is the empty, masculine, black space in which this arises. But the light, luminosity, is what's dancing, is what you see, and stuff out here. And so each moment of our existence is this union of consciousness and light. And that's relationship in its ultimate sense. And that's what's so great about it. I'll tell you very briefly, because I think it's one of the really, really brilliant and enduring contributions of the great traditions, particularly Vedanta and Vajrayana. And that is the whole notion that there is not just a spectrum of consciousness, but a spectrum of matter energy. And that they literally sort of follow each other all the way up the scale. So on the interior, you can have a state of consciousness like waking, dreaming, deep sleep, meditative states, even big mind. But on the exterior of that, there's an actual body or energy that goes along with it. And so there's a gross body, and technically gross, subtle, and causal means just this. There's a gross body, a subtle body, and a causal body. And the traditions mean, for example, when you're in the dream state, there is no gross physical body. And so you're in the dream state and you are seeing other beings, you're having conversations, you're in an image body, they're in an image body, you can see them, you can still have emotions, you can still have thought, but there's no physicality in the dream state. So there are no rocks, no Gaia, no nature in that sense. But there's a whole realm of a kind of subtle bodies, and you are in a kind of a subtle body. And so they're giving a phenomenology of the fact that there's no consciousness that doesn't have some form of body or matter energy associated with it. So in the four quadrants, if you look at the upper left and the upper right, even though we tend to draw it, just have like atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, triune brains, stuff like that. That's sort of the gross physical aspect of that. But it's a whole spectrum of energy, gross, subtle, and causal energy. And there's a lot of work being done on measuring some of these subtle energies, and subtle energy medicine has made huge strides in this. It's not well known, but the empirical research on this is quite substantial. Most people have heard about Kirlian photography and stuff like that, which is the worst of that kind of evidence. But that kind of stuff is out there. The traditions maintain that every mind has a body. But again, there's gross, subtle, causal mind, gross, subtle, causal bodies. And that's a very profound notion, because what it does mean is that, for example, in the Bardo realm, and you may or may not want to believe in reincarnation, but if you do, the traditions explain it, that the body that carries you from one physical body to the next body is a subtle body, the same subtle body you have in the dream state. So you have a consciousness and a body in the subtle realm. And that, so you have, in a sense, a gross body mind, a subtle body mind, and a causal body mind. That's a very profound way to handle the mind-body problem. But it also allows something that merely saying I'm physically embodied only, it allows something that won't, which is you can still have transmigration, because the physical body mind can die, and the subtle body mind can transmigrate. But it still has its own body. And even the causal, which is deep dreamless sleep, for example, or states of formless meditation, they're said to be a causal or a very subtle body, made of the very, very finest matter energy or mass energy. And so each of those gross, subtle, and causal energy are things that you could see in the exterior world if you had the appropriate eyes. So some people see auras, for example, subtle kinds of subtle energy. And we can actually start to measure these with very sophisticated machines that are working on subtle energy machines. But none of the interiors can be seen. None of your interiors can be seen. And that's what makes them so, well, you can't put your finger on them. So right now, for example, in the lower left quadrant, mutual understanding. Right now we have mutual understanding, where we're attempting to understand each other. Where is mutual understanding? Can you point to it? Can you put your finger on it? If you have a desire, where is desire? Can you actually point to it, say it's here or it's there? When you feel love, where do you feel? Other than the projectile vomiting. Where do you feel love? All the interiors don't have this kind of simple location, but the extraordinary thing that the traditions of the Dr. Vajrayana said is that nonetheless these consciousness, they all ride on bodies, they ride on energies. And the whole secret of Tantra is that you can better get into these states of consciousness if you know how to manipulate these body energies. So it's often said to be sexual energies, but that's just part of the spectrum. There's gross, subtle, and causal energies, or a whole spectrum of sexual energy, if you want to think about it that way, bodily energies. And by using mudras, by using concentration techniques, you can get control of some of your bodily energies, and those will evoke the state of consciousness. So that includes extended periods of having sex, for example, sexual intercourse, because that can raise very, very strong subtle energies and can help you get into an interior state of, well, sex wonderfully concentrates the mind, doesn't it? Sex and death. So these are two wonderful things you can use for meditation. If you've got a wandering, if a guy's got a wandering mind, show him a naked woman. It's instant samadhi. Like, wow. So, yeah. So it's a clever use of those kinds of energies that can help focus the mind, both men and women. So the answer to the question, is there ever an interior without an energy? And I would say no. Not in the relative plane. And I think that's what's so interesting about it. I would say all four quadrants arise simultaneously. The four quadrants are four aspects of anything that arises in the relative plane, whether it's gross or subtle or causal. In the dream state, there are others. You see other beings in the dream state. And that's the lower right. If there's any communication with them at all, that's the lower left. That's your understanding. There is communication occurring there. None of these things tend to arise by themselves. They're all mutually interwoven. So all four quadrants tend to arise. And it does mean that in any of these, even if you're disembodied infinite formless consciousness, we're not talking about big mind now. That's absolute. We're talking all relative manifestation. In that case, gross, subtle, and causal. Causal is taken to be the subtlest of the manifest forms arising in big mind. So even causal in Vedanta, for example, has a subtle bliss energy associated with it. And so it stops consciousness from ever being disembodied. And that's a really extraordinary, profoundly integrated kind of notion. But it also stops us from pulling back into what we think can be merely abstract conscious disembodied states, because there isn't any. Quadrants are just another way of talking about first, second, and third person pronouns. All natural languages have I. The first person is defined as the person who is speaking. So at this moment, I'm first person, as it should be. Second person is the person being spoken to. So you would be second person at this point. Third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So if I'm talking about that chart, that's a third person in this definition. If I'm talking about Roger, he's third person. I'm talking about him as an it, or he or him. When we talk second person, I to you or I to thou, that's a very intimate connection. That means that two sentient beings are somehow resonating with each other. There is all natural languages have first, second, and third person pronouns because these actually represent perspectives you can take when looking at reality. And there are other ways of saying first, second, and third person. Art, morals, and science are first, second, and third person. Art is first person expression. Morals is you. How do I get along with you? How do we get along? That's the good. And truth, objective truth, is what science looks at. So whenever you hear the good, the true, and the beautiful, or art, morals, and science, or Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, same thing. And we find these reappearing everywhere. And we codify them as the four quadrants. We subdivide it into plural to have a kind of symmetry. You can talk about a singular it, which is mostly what atomists do and positivists do. Or you can talk about systems of interacting processes, and that's what systems theorists do and sociologists. And so that's the lower right quadrant, which is social systems. The upper right is an individual it. I can look at my own being as a third person it, from a third person perspective. So if I look at Roger as a third person, and then he's going to be about this high, I'm going to cut open his brain, if we can find it. It will have dopamine, serotonin, marijuana, gaping hole here. That's science does that. Science. So in the upper right, we have brain organism. You have a limbic system. You have a reptilian brain stem. You have a liver, etc. Those are fine. Those are all it. That's the science side of the street. If I talk to Roger as a person, go, how you doing? Good. Excellent. So that's an I-you, that's an I-thou. So we're actually exchanging, we're touching. There's a resonance, there's a mutual resonance. So the I-thou relationship is very important. That's why all languages have a second person in it, because it really means it's something that I'm resonating with as a sentient bearer of consciousness. So there's an implied use of second person, which is that second person has a first person. And that, so if Roger talks to me, he's first person and I'm second person. Mm-hmm. If Roger and I reach mutual understanding, we'll both use the pronoun we. And that's a really interesting thing, this we. It just means we understand each other. And if I say, Roger, do we understand each other? And he'll say, yes, we understand each other. That we is magic. It's extraordinary. It's probably one of the greatest mysteries of all. And so much so that a lot of great mystics like Martin Buber would say that God is found in the I-thou relationship. Because it's where we touch that spirit can be shared. And ultimately can be shared because it's one spirit. But you notice that when you touch another relative human being, you both resonate and say, I know what you mean. Or I love you. Or I feel you. Or I'm here with you. That I-thou relationship, in a sense, God is the hyphen. the point of touch. That's one way of looking at it. Of course, spirit is the empty ground in which this is arising. But that one I can understand another I in mutual understanding or resonance as a we is just extraordinary. So we put that in the lower left quadrant, and we technically is first person plural, but when I and thou touch, it forms a we, and we say we understand each other. And so the lower left quadrant is, we sometimes write it as you/we or thou/we, but it means this whole extraordinary second person relationship, whether it's singular or plural, where science would look at this whole gathering here as an objective system, look at it in terms of facts and just the values. Morals looks at this we. How do we treat each other? What is the good life? What should I do? Not what is, but what should be the case. So that's why we have the good, the true, and the beautiful, or art, morals, and science. These are all variations on first, second, and third person. So first person is also the interior I, and that's in the upper left. And that's where we're talking about consciousness of an individual sentient being. And that is it's also art, because art is self-expression. It's beauty that's in the eye of the beholder. So these quadrants we use these to help orient us and to stop us from reductionism. By reductionism, I mean, if you look, for example, in consciousness studies today in the universities, there's a raging argument about which is the correct way to approach consciousness. From a third-person scientific point of view, look at it in the upper right as consciousness, the product of brain chemistry and neurosynapses and serotonin and dopamine. And when you have a certain complexity in organic structure, consciousness emerges from it's all it language. It's all described in third-person its and objects. Those are there. We're not denying those are there. We're denying consciousness to be fully explained in those terms. The other side of the argument uses phenomenology, or I consciousness, and says, no, the only thing that's real is my own introspective awareness. That's what's real. Don't tell me the subjective stuff is out there, because that's experienced only in my own consciousness. So phenomenology, which deals with the upper left, is an intense attempt to reduce all we and it to phenomena that arise in my consciousness. We're not saying that that isn't there either. That is also there, and that's important. What we are saying is that the battle between first-person approaches and third-person approaches is a not useful battle anymore. They're both correct. And that's one of the sort of main things that we go on in the integral approach is everybody is right. That everybody has a grain of truth that has to be included. We sort of make fun of it by saying no brain can produce 100% error. Nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time. Therefore, every single major approach to human knowledge has some degree of truth. The integral approach insists upon honoring those truths. The tricky part then is how they all fit together. And that's where the game gets interesting. It's an entirely different kind of game to play. Usually if you go to school of philosophy, or go to school of psychology, or any of the disciplines, if you take up a school of psychotherapy, for example, they'll spend a great deal of time telling you why the other schools are mistaken. And that's sort of what your education is. It's figuring out why so many other people are fucked up. We don't take that approach. For us, every single approach has to have some grain of truth. And so now you're asking a different question, you're playing a different game. And the game here is, how do they all fit together into a larger coherent structure that honors all of these important insights? So the quadrants are a way to just remind us, are we really looking at the interior, at self, at aesthetics, at art? Every occasion, that means every actual event, every moment has at least these four quadrants. In other words, every moment has a perspective of I, we, and it. So every moment has an aesthetic component to it. It has a beauty, it has a form. Every moment has an interactive component. We're actually interacting with people. And every moment can be looked at objectively as well. So we're not saying that these are nice things to have. We're saying they're actually the structure of every moment as it's arising. How do you define integral art? And this came up actually in one of our discussions at the integral art branch, because it's a very difficult issue. And part of it is because, in this case, we're talking about an artifact, right? It's something that, an artifact is something that a sentient holon produces. So a bird produces a bird nest. That's an artifact, okay? An ant can produce an anthill. Anthill is an artifact. we produce, Armani suits, airplanes, pizzas, Uzis, dynamite. Those are all artifacts. So a lot of the other branches were defining integral medicine as sort of something the doctor was doing or something that was happening with a patient or a client. And we didn't have to really run up against this question because those aren't artifacts, those are human beings. So you could define an integral physician as somebody who's integrally informed, and that's sort of fairly easy. But we were looking at artworks and going, now how do you define an integral artwork? And the initial thought was, well, it's art that has all the quadrants and all the levels and all the lines all put into it, like this Wagnerian nightmare descending on the audience and just assaulting every single orifice you have. And we decided, well, as much fun as that would be, that probably wasn't what we wanted to call integral art. It might be. But I give an example just sort of as a thought experiment. Let's say that we had a Zen master, and just for the sake of argument, let's say that this person's consciousness was integral. And suppose that Zen master draws, as often happens, a single bamboo shoot. Now, is that integral art? And so what we decided is that integral art is any artifact produced by an integral consciousness. Now, that you have to have integral consciousness at the moment. So just the fact that you're, integrally conscious 2 or 3 times a week doesn't mean that if you hit an off day that it's going to be integral art. You actually have to be interested in doing that. And then it also can be judged on its own other characteristics. In other words, it might be a good execution, the tone might be well, the color might be done well, the texture might be done well. But the whole point is that it's coming from an integrally informed consciousness that's taking these perspectives into account. Then whether it draws a rock, a bug, or a Wagnerian opera, that's integral art, or integrally informed artifact. And that gets to a very interesting question then about how do you interpret art. And that gets off in this whole thing. And I've written a lot on how to interpret art, because what you're doing is you're looking at an artifact. And this happens whether you're looking at archaeology, looking at buildings that were built centuries ago. You're looking at some artifact that was built by consciousness. And so one of the ways you interpret it is, what's the level of consciousness that built the artifact? So that becomes part of an integral way of interpreting art. There are many other ways, but that's certainly one of them. Now, with business, a little bit different, but some of that comes into play, because a large part of what business does, remember economics is defined as, one of the definitions, is the exchange of goods and services. Now, services usually means human involved. So now you're talking integral business as if there's an integrally informed human at one end of that. And so that's why we try to talk about integral transformative practice for what you're doing, and if you want to get your consciousness integrally informed, then that becomes important. But you also can be creating a widget, okay, or an automobile, or an artifact. And then the same things as an artist comes into play. Is this an integrally informed product? And if it is, it's going to be a product that's better than one that isn't, because there's more depth that went into it, more consideration that went into it, and so on. So it gets very interesting playing this. But again, the best thing, in a sense, you can do is you just keep cognitively learning this, because that pushes the clearing further that all these other understandings will start to step into. And much like a word processor at the beginning, it's a little bit complex. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But the more you kind of use it, then it's like sooner or later the word process is just blindingly easy, and it's really fast and sort of starts to come to you a little bit more quickly. The first time in history, we actually have access to all of the world's cultures, all of their forms of transformation. We have stuff going all the way back to shamanic techniques, all the way through the great axial wisdom traditions. We have various yogas, east and west. We have some of the most profound contemplative traditions of all of humanity. They're all available to us, certainly at least in terms of study, but also increasingly just in this country. We have transmitted, realized teachers in virtually all of the great contemplative and meditative traditions. This has never, ever, ever happened in history. So on the one hand, we can put all of these things on the table and look at them and say, what can we learn from them? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And there's important truths in all of them. And what we want to be able to do is sort of look at this without diluting any of them, without trying to get any of them to change, but simply putting them all together in a way that they are mutually reinforcing, mutually beneficial. And we can start to discern the key ingredients of transformation by studying what all of them have in common, using some of them to fill in the gaps that are perhaps not present in others. And that's just from the great wisdom traditions. The world of modernity and post-modernity is not exactly populated with stupid people, just most of it. A profound understanding of human growth and development has been contributed by the modern West. And there are aspects of consciousness that modernity and post-modernity have spotted that you can find in no sutras, no tantras, no Kabbalah texts, no Sufist texts, and so on. So for the first time in history, we really have a chance of putting all of these things together, and not in a way to sort of put them all down, but in a way to mutually enrich them. And that's really extraordinary. So on the one hand, that's actually available to us now. And it's only in the past 10, 20 years that this has happened. So on the one hand, we stand on the verge of a great adventure. And I think in terms of wherever men and women appreciate realization or enlightenment, or plumbing the depths of their own potential, or in any sense waking up to their own true nature, deeper realities, profounder meanings, and a greater social good. I think whether we end up doing this or somebody else ends up doing this, this era will be known as the first great attempt to integrate, synthesize, coordinate the entire heritage of human transformative techniques. So that's what I think that's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's goosebumpy if you think about it, but I think history will look back on the several decade period as the time when the first truly world religion, if you will, or world spirituality, if you will, or world philosophy started to come together. And that doesn't mean we're going to iron out differences. It's like if you have an international cuisine, international cooking, you have Mexican and Chinese and Italian, and they all remain what they are. The whole point about international cooking is not that you take Italian food and mush it with enchiladas and then spread it and sort of melt it all down into a gray, hominy grits. All of them can remain what they are. We're not trying to change necessarily any particular path. What we are doing is putting them together and saying which of these work best in these circumstances, what kinds of modules do we need to do, what are the most effective forms for different types of people and where they are. So it's a whole skillful means of putting together this extraordinary smorgasbord of ways that you can grow and develop and ultimately continue to realize deeper and deeper aspects of your own being. It's not necessary that you become an Olympic decathlon champion in every single module, level, line, quadrant, state, type. Because as we say, that could take months. And I know some of you are much more hurried than that. And so if you take something like just weightlifting, the cognitive understanding, you do need a cognitive map or the step won't stick. Cognitive is very important. We'll explain a little bit more about that. Some form of meditative practice and a little bit of psychodynamic work. Touching in on those four, and there are a dozen other modules you can get involved in. Those four alone can dramatically and profoundly change your body's physiology, your capacity to integrate material, and dramatically accelerate your movement through any stages that exist. And so you can do a very compact form of integral transformative practice. It doesn't take more time doing this in order to get realization. As a matter of fact, what we know in terms of combining some of these in a spiritual cross-training is that results are faster if you do a little bit of cross-training than if you don't. And so Houston Smith used to say, bless his heart, because he's still working his mind around this, that he doesn't have time to do ITP. And the answer is, you don't have time not to. It's a much faster approach. I'll give you a very quick example. Mike Murphy just told me about a big research project that they finished. And this is very simple. They had weightlifting and Vipassana. Now, for those of you who are, we'll increasingly give you information on what weightlifting does, resistance training. Over a 6-month period, if you do not much more than a half an hour 3 times a week, it can turn back most physiological age markers up to 10 years. It's staggering what that can do in terms of helping to rejuvenate just that component of your being. And if you have that much more rejuvenated energy and capacity, you're going to be able to apply it to whatever you do and make it much more efficient, more effective. So they took people who were doing just Vipassana meditation, those who were doing Vipassana and weightlifting. They didn't tell the teachers which group was doing which, but they let the teachers judge who made the most progress in Vipassana meditation. And you can guess what happened. Those who did Vipassana and weightlifting advanced through the Vipassana stages of meditation faster than those who just did the meditation. So again, you don't have time not to cross-train. It takes much, much too long to pick a path and grunt your way through it for a couple of decades. So although that's nice to do, if you want to do that. So again, I really don't want to put any of these down. What we are trying to suggest is that it's more efficient and more effective to do some degree of this kind of cross-training. It actually, at the very least, it's not going to take you more time. And it's extremely likely it's going to shorten some of the time that you're going to have to do some of these things.
What are our markers for the effectiveness of our practices? How do we know that our ITP program that we've put together is doing?
Yeah, there are fewer and fewer people in the world that can understand you. Your friends drop off dramatically. And you find yourself spending more and more time alone Saturday night, basking in the radiance of your own bliss. You thought finding a boyfriend was hard now. Try putting up with stupid under these circumstances. It's one of those classic never-ending sliding scales. And the scales are almost always paradoxical. The first thing that doesn't happen is it's not that you have less pain. And it's not that you have less turmoil. It's that you become more accepting of it. In some ways you become more sensitive the more you grow. And the more sensitive you are, to other people's suffering. And so it's really, your capacity to get hurt is going to increase dramatically. And your capacity to handle it is going to increase even more. And that's the great thing about it. You become bigger in all dimensions. You become deeper in all dimensions. And bodhisattvas cry daily. It's not just all fun and games. So you'll know it primarily by how increasingly sensitive you get. You're more open to more perspectives. You feel into more individuals. There's a certain point you'll see with Big Mind and Big Heart where you are inhabiting the insides of everybody. So there's a permeability to everything that increases, and a strength in all of it that increases. And you'll find ways of tracking that intuitively. Does that make sense to some of that? Yeah. But we still have in the back of our minds the notion of the Superman, that when you get enlightened, nothing bothers you. You have no pain, you have no suffering, it's just, you just breeze through life like some sort of cross between James Bond and Catwoman. And it's just not how it works. What happens is that your capacity for all of this is much, much, much more sensitive, and your capacity to handle it outpaces that. And so it's a very, very interesting thing. I think you'll cry more. I think you'll laugh more. I think you'll feel intense bliss and intense sadness. There's a sense in which you will cry for every sentient being alive. It will tear your heart out. And you will also know that there are no sentient beings to awaken. And that will give you more joy than you can imagine. And all these things, the glorious, grand mixture of all of that, it's extraordinary. And all continues to arise, but it self-liberates in its own space. But if you're not getting more sensitive to all these things, then I think you're really doing something wrong. Yeah. The four that I mentioned as being, I think, fairly core practices, namely cognitive, psychodynamic, meditative, and physical, particularly weightlifting, continue to be the ones that I touch in with most often. And for me in particular, one of the really strong changes I had was when I started doing weightlifting, which really wasn't until quite late into the game for me. Very tall, I'm 6'4", 6'5", and for most of my adult life I weighed around 170 pounds. And that's, technical term is cerebrotonic ectomorph. It means painfully skinny intellectual is the translation. So we're basically just one big, neuronal center with a thin line of body nutritional support. The support system sort of barely dangling down under the brain. And what I found is that as I would sit and do writing and then sit and do meditation, it was ridiculous because that actually takes a lot of muscles to sit in one place and not move for a long time. So what happened really starting about 15 years ago, I really went on a prolonged, just really systematic resistance training or weightlifting program. And over a very long period, because people that are skinny do have a hard time putting on muscle, but it can be done. And I went from 170 pounds to about 200 pounds. And it was a huge change for me. Because even if you're sitting at a desk for 8 or 10 hours a day, you can circulate prana, you can circulate bioenergy if you're not constantly sort of not being able to hold yourself up really in a certain sense. And that to me was a big change, because I think like so many intellectuals or even meditators, the idea is you can sort of, the aesthetic approach is just we're going to transcend the body, so let that sucker just waste away, we don't care. And it was a real change for me. It was, even though I'd been an integral thinker for a long time, I think it was one of the most important things I did in terms of trying to be a little bit more integral in my own orientation. It seems very simple and very almost prosaic, but it really can be quite profound. And that's remained a cornerstone. I think and I did yoga for 15, 20 years at first. I still do that, but I think a judicious combination of yoga and weightlifting really does help. And once you get yourself in shape, it's not much more really than 15 minutes 3 times a week. You really can keep what you've done if you do that. And the physiological markers, they really do, it's staggering. So much so that Bob Arnott, the house physician on ABC News, so this is a very conservative doctor, in reviewing all of the research, including research done with people 70 years old, Emory University, lift weights for 6 months, and their physiological age markers go from 70 years to 58 years old. It turns it back 12 years. So he's summarized all of the empirical research to date by saying the old paradigm was aerobics is everything. In other words, everybody thought you just sort of run. If you do, all sorts of disease markers start going up. I mean, long distance runners drop dead of everything at a high rate. The new paradigm is muscles are the engine of youth. So it's just, it sets in motion a whole series of physiological changes in the body that can be very, very helpful. And I think that's why it increases your capacity for concentration, and therefore you do Vipassana better, among other things. So that's been real important. I continue to do that. Cognitive, it might sound funny, because cognitive, a lot of people have a misunderstanding about cognitive. They think it means linear, logic, abstract thinking. That's an extremely small part of what cognitive is. Cognitive really means consciousness, and cognitive psychologists use it to mean cognition is the capacity to take perspectives. So you can take a first-person perspective, but in order for me to try to see the world through your eyes, to understand you as an individual person, to put myself in your shoes and walk in your shoes for a while, my body can't do that. If I'm going to just feel my feelings, I'm feeling my feelings. To look at your perspective, that's a mental act. I have to mentally put myself in your shoes. So cognition is the way we get to a second-person perspective, and a third person, and so on. So some people say, well, there's cognition, and then, but there's love, and that's more feeling, and that's the spiritual component. That's backwards. If I'm going to love you as something other than an extension of myself, I have to be able to see you. If I can't see you and understand what you want as a separate person, I can't love you. Seeing your perspective is cognition. So the cognitive line, research has consistently shown, is necessary but not sufficient for all the other lines of development. So it doesn't mean that you have to sit and study calculus. That's a very, very narrow, abstract thing that you can do Saturday night if you can't get a date, but other than that, it just means what we're trying to do when we ask you to learn the AQUA model, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, is it's stretching you. You're taking other perspectives when you do that. And that creates a clearing or a space in your consciousness that your other potentials can rise into. And so we find that you can have a peak experience. You can even have a Kensho or a Satori, because those are states. But if you don't have a cognitive development that can hold it, it'll slip. So I've found just increasingly just engaging a cognitive program helps you, it stretches your mind to take more and more perspectives of more and more sentient beings. And if you look at most of the great contemplative traditions, look at Tibetan Buddhism, for example, probably the most complete meditative contemplative system anywhere in the world. And fully half of a monk's day is spent in intellectual debate. It's taking the role of others, using the mind so you can transcend the mind. So that's remained very important. And the last one is psychodynamic. Because constantly what we find in the great spiritual traditions is that although they excelled in many, many things, they weren't very good at spotting psychodynamic, unconscious shadow issues. And because of that, even great spiritual teachers and masters, men or women, and east or west, north or south, they can make great, great strides and even have a stabilized, realized awareness. But there can be little components of themselves that don't yield to that awareness. And they're down there, and they're these shadow elements, and they really cause problems. They're probably the single biggest saboteur of spiritual practice. And it's one of the great, great things that the West, modern West, has added to our understanding. So those four are still the ones that I touch in with the most. And periodically you extend it. You try to work with interpersonal relationships, organizational relationships. For me, who spent most of my life writing, and to step into a position of administrative work at things like Integral Institute and Integral University that's a big module. It's winning, but that's another way you can continue to grow and develop. There are certainly types of states that are available to you that are much bigger than you might suspect at any given moment. And the interesting thing about Big Mind is it's one of a series of states that human beings are said to have, in a sense, ever-present access to. And Big Mind, in a sense, is sort of the most important, let's put it that way. It's ever-present consciousness, it's Godhead, it's Tao, it's the abyss, it's the unqualifiable suchness of this in every moment. And as we were saying the last time we were together, one of the interesting things about it is it's really sort of the only thing you've ever really deeply known. All the other phenomena have changed. We were saying, you can remember that you were around last week. You were doing something last week, right? Yes. Everybody, yeah, I remember last week. What? You don't know. All you know is that I am was there. And that fundamental ever-present I amness is that fundamental condition upon which everything arises, including your own finite self. So having that ever-present condition, getting a little glimpse of that, getting a taste of that pointed out, is a very, very profound kind of reorientation and remembrance of this fundamental birthright that belongs to literally every sentient being. So that's a few of you that didn't get it, you're going to go, I want to take that class again. We'll come back and keep working with it. And it's something that we'll continue to clarify. And there are many, many different paths to this. One of the reasons we like working with Genpo and Diane and John Kessler and some of the people that are working with that process is that it is a relatively quick and straightforward introduction to your original face. The traditions maintain that there are several states of consciousness that are indeed ever-present, that you have access to. A human being, now we're talking, not sentient beings. All sentient beings have Buddha mind, or Godhead, or spark of absolute spirit. That's the definition of being a sentient being, being an individual holon, all the way down. Quarks, atoms, Republicans, all have a spark of that awareness. Is proof of God's greatness if ever there was one. Now we of course love Democrats and Republicans because we are integral. I have to explain that. What we want to talk about though a little bit is the difference between states and stages. States of consciousness and stages of consciousness. And we're going to find in particular there are at least two different kinds of stages. The first kind of stages are found throughout all of the meditative traditions. You can find them in St. Teresa of Avila when she talks about the 7 interior castles and then defines these 7 stages of experience that she has. You can find them in the contemplative texts the world over. There's another kind of stage that is really a discovery of the modern West. You find it literally no place in any tradition except starting about 100 to 200 years ago, a certain kind of research that is one of the West's great contribution to psychology. And these are the stages that have indeed been investigated by people like Jane Lovinger and Claire Graves and Abe Maslow and Piaget and so on. We'll come back and talk about those. Those kinds of stages, there are many different aspects to them, but a part of them are intersubjective. And so they don't show up in meditation or contemplation. You can sit on a Zen mat for 20 years, and you will never see a thought that says, this is a moral stage 3 thought, and this is a moral stage 4 thought. Oh, there goes a yellow thought. Oh, there goes a red thought. It's just not going to happen. Those stages have to be discovered by a particular type of inquiry. And it's kind of research. Once they're discovered, you can look at your own mind and go, well, by gosh, I can see that these kinds of things do indeed tend to exist. So it's a real crucial issue for any form of integral psychology and especially integral psychotherapy that we take into account states and both kinds of stages. Because you won't get both kinds of stages in any tradition that's out there. So every tradition out there up to this point is not quite integral. And so that's one of the things we want to take into account. So I'll come back and circle back or talk a little bit about these in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to set that up a little bit. And I'll talk just a few more minutes about states and these two kinds of stages, and then we'll zero in on some of these particular issues. The general notion of states and stages, you find that model going all the way back as early as Vedanta and Vajrayana. And it's one of the really great, the Vedanta, the simple Vedanta model is one of the really primordial, absolutely best, small, succinct psychological models you can find. And Vajrayana agrees with it. The Vedanta model is very simple. It has 5 levels or stages called the sheaths. It has 3 states and it has 3 bodies, or 3 energies. And with those simple 3 little variables, you can cover about 90% of what you really need to cover in a lot of these things. So the stages, the 5 stages, the sheaths covering Atman or Brahman are literally like the levels of consciousness, or the stages that we would look at, some of the types of stages we would look at. And it goes from the Annamaya Kosha to the Pranamaya Kosha to the Manomaya Kosha to the Vijnanamaya Kosha to the Anandamaya Kosha. That basically means that from food to emotional sexual energy to early mind to higher mind and then to transpersonal bliss mind. Those are conceived as sheaths around your own self. So that big mind that you were introduced to, one of the reasons that you don't always remember it is that there are these 5 sort of layers over it, and you start paying attention to something that's going on in one of those 5 layers, then all of a sudden you forget ever present. And that's okay. That's sort of how the game gets going. It's kind of fun. So those are the 5 levels of sheaths. And you can use the 7 chakras, very similar, instead of the 5, and you get essentially the same thing. And you find those models present as well. Then they add 2 other components, though, to give 3 components altogether, and that's what makes it so interesting. One component is states of consciousness. The 5 sheaths are stages or structures of consciousness. The states of consciousness, and there are anywhere between 3 and 5 of those, are waking, dreaming, deep sleep. They then add 4th, Turiya, the ever-present witness, and there's a 5th, Turiyatita, which means one taste. So these states can have different stages in them. And they were smart enough to see that. They were smart enough to see that if you're in a dream state at night, you can actually have 2 or 3 of these levels operating, 2 or 3 stages operating. So that's a very, very profound insight. And then they add a 3rd component, which is even more profound. And that's that every mind has a body. So every state or stage of consciousness has an energy associated with it, an energetic component. And they call it either prana, or they sometimes call it bodies. They sometimes call it wind. The Tibetans call it wind, lung, R-L-U-N-G. But so the idea is that the waking state must have a body to support it, the waking state mind, and it does. It has a gross body. And then if you're in a dream state, or in a bardo, or in a meditative state, and you're in a subtle state, it has to have a body, and that's the subtle body. It's an actual energy that supports that consciousness. And even in the causal, deep, formless sleep, there's a very, very subtle body. And the Tibetans actually call it gross, subtle, and very subtle. And Vedanta calls it gross, subtle, causal. And that's a causal body. It's a fine, fine, all-pervading energy or feeling. So you can actually have a whole series of feeling energy components going with the cognitive components. This is going to come back to what you're talking about. So it depends on just where you want to feel yourself in relation to the cosmos. So if you feel yourself in this physical body right here and right now, which is a good place to start, we don't want to forget that, then you're in the gross body, which is a nice thing to have on occasion, if it's not running a fever. Then it's that, but you actually feel yourself right there. Now if you move into a subtle body, it starts to get more interesting. Subtle body is something you have in the dream state, for example. In the dream state, a lot of very interesting things are happening. You can fly, you can move around. It's a very plastic, expandable condition. And in the bardo realm, if you are making that trip, the traditions that believe in that believe that this is the car you're driving in that journey. So the subtle body is what takes you from gross body to gross body in terms of reincarnation. And then, so you can feel the subtle body expand. And this is where we kind of live our energy. If you're feeling relaxed now, you can feel your subtle body kind of expand, include. We get very loving and very open, which is very, very nice. And then if somebody, like criticizes the integral model or something, and then, but I'm bigger than that. And Tong Lin is a way to move into other people's energetic bodies and exchange self for other, so that you can actually see how fluid it ultimately. Remember, all of these bodies are arising in big mind. They're all arising in that ever-present state that you've tasted. And it's just a matter of where you want to locate yourself in that cosmos of what's arising. Now the causal body, the subtle body, is this wonderful sort of accordion energy. And the causal body is in a sense, because it's very close to emptiness. It's very much like deep, dreamless sleep and very much like formless meditation. But they maintain there is an energy there. And there is a sheath, Anandamaya Kosha, which is a very subtle sheath of bliss. So you can we were talking a little bit about how right on the outside of emptiness there's being, consciousness, bliss, or joy, or happiness. So emptiness has a faint edge of thrilling bliss. It's sort of one of the easy ways to sort of identify it, but you don't want to get caught up in dualistic notions about it and exclude other states. But the causal body, you can feel the causal body if you just feel that which is sort of all-pervading. And so you can feel that particularly on the out-breath. When you breathe in, you're sort of bringing down that causal body into your subtle and then physical body. But on the out-breath, and you can just feel it. It's all-pervading. It expands literally to infinity. You find that model going all the way back as early as Vedanta and Vajrayana. And it's one of the really great, the Vedanta, the simple Vedanta model is one of the really primordial, absolutely best, small, succinct psychological models you can find. And Vajrayana agrees with it. The Vedanta model is very... These states are very important because a lot of people, once they start using stages, get on a mistaken notion that you have to be at a really high stage in order to have access to these deeply spiritual occasions, and you don't. You can be at virtually any stage and have access to these four great states. So gross, subtle, and causal states are ever present. Even an infant wakes, dreams, and sleeps. Even a 4-month-old fetus is being plunged into gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual states. So that's something that every human sentient being comes with, is access to these states and the domains that they come with. Now the interesting thing about states is that they're not really filled in with a lot of content. And you can just sort of even kind of do a thought experiment about the dream content of young children. And there's been research done on this, but you can imagine the dream content of a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old. And I'll use spiral dynamics for stages just very briefly. A 2-year-old's not going to have orange thoughts or green thoughts or blue thoughts. Those just haven't developed yet. And it's not going to have dreams that have a highly structured linguistic capacity either. If you wake a 6-month-old infant up, it doesn't go, why, yes, by George, I was dreaming of having tea and crumpets the other day. It's not linguistic. The dreams, it hasn't been structured yet. But it's still the dream state. We all sort of understand that even a 6-month-old dreaming is in the same similar-ish dream state that we're in. So these great potentials are given to human beings at any stage of development. And that's really important because it plays certainly into therapy, because it means we can draw on these states in a therapeutic way whenever we want. And many of you are already talking about some of the ways that you can actually bring very profound transpersonal moments to bear on a therapeutic situation, no matter where a person is developmentally. And that's very, very important. So part of the problem in the early transpersonal movement is that there was kind of a war between the camps that were looking mostly at states of consciousness. And they were claiming it was all ever present. You can just do holotropic breath work and do this wonderful, and you're getting in touch with everything. And then there were people that were doing stage work, and they were going, you know what? It's not quite that simple. There are stage things that just don't show up and aren't ever present. And so obviously the integral model does both. That's right. So these are very, very important. We want to include both of these things. And we'll come back on how that ties in. So on this, let's now look just very briefly at the stages and talk about those two different types of stages. Because this again is why we haven't quite had an integral model until recently, because we just haven't seen enough of these things all put on the table where we can start to pull them together. So the first kind of stage is indeed the kind of stage conception that you do find in the great meditative texts, and you find a lot of them. They are first-person, phenomenal stages of experiential unfolding. And they typically happen in a course of meditation. If you want probably the very, very best study of this, and it's still a classic, and that's the one that Daniel P. Brown did, and we included it in the book Transformations of Consciousness. He studied over 13 meditative traditions in Tibetan and Sanskrit and Chinese, and showed a similarity in terms of how they report interior experiences unfolding. Now again, these are not rigid rungs or anything like that. They're just waves of experience that tend to unfold in a certain sequence. And Classically what happens is, just to use generalized terms, you start in meditation and you sort of deal with gross objects first, and all the obvious things come in, and then you learn how to quiet the mind, and then subtler and subtler perceptions start to emerge, and then you quiet the mind more, and then generally a stream of luminosity, perhaps love, bliss, and so on starts to emerge. And if you keep doing that, you can actually get into unmanifest absorption, those kinds of things. You can look at the 7 interior castles, you can look at St. John of the Cross, you can look at almost any of the great contemplative traditions, and they have stages of meditative unfolding. Again, not in rigid, ladder-like things, but just waves that tend to unfold in a certain sequence. And when you master one set, then another set of experiences tend to occur. So you can find those stages in the meditative traditions. They're very important. We try to take them into account. Even the 10 Zen ox herding pictures is another version of stages of meditation. What you won't find is the second kind of stages, the intersubjective ones that have been pioneered by Western researchers. And there's a couple reasons you won't tend to find it. And one is that they're not available to your first-person introspection. And the reason they're not is that these structures that have been investigated by Piaget or by Jane Loevinger or Claire Graves, spiral dynamics, integral psychology has probably 2 or 3 dozen, the book Integral Psychology, 2 or 3 dozen researchers on these stages. These stages are deduced by looking at groups of people over long periods of time. And I give the example that Carol Gilligan used very quickly. She was looking at female moral development. She had been studying with Lawrence Kohlberg, and Kohlberg had found 3 major stages of moral development that he called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. We sometimes call them egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric. She wanted to see if the same thing worked for women, so she did a pilot study using women. And the moral dilemma that she posed to them had to do with abortion. Does a woman have a right to an abortion? Now, Kohlberg had famously asked these kinds of dilemmas. One of the most famous was, a man is married to a wife who has a lethal terminal illness. There's a medicine that will save her life. Does he have the right to steal the medicine? And Kohlberg found that people gave 3 different responses. The first response was, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine. The second response was, no, he does not have the right to steal the medicine. And the third response was, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine. So you ask, well, okay, why? So the first response, yes, he has the right to steal the medicine because what's right is what I say is right, fuck you. Okay, that's known as pre-conventional. That's egocentric. That's, I'm it and that's that. The second response was, no, you can't steal the medicine, even though it could save, somebody's life. Why not? Well, that would be against the law. That's conformist or conventional stage. It's just you can't break the law. That would be horrible. My country, right or wrong. And it's a very, very unself-reflexive. Now, it's a step up from egocentric because it's taking a second-person perspective into account. But it can't get out of the conformity of rules. So, oh, no, breaking the law would be terrible. No, I couldn't steal it. Third response is, yes, you can steal the medicine. Why? Well, because life is worth more than $22. And there's a larger issue involved in this. And so it's a very highly reasoned moral response. And it was noticing that the pre-conventional, the post-conventional almost always gave the same answer. That got me onto the pre-trans fallacy and how often they get confused. But we see it very, very clearly there. Well, Carol Gilligan ask the same kinds of questions about abortion. She found the same thing, the same 3 stages that women go through. Yes, she has the right to an abortion. No, she doesn't. Yes, she does. And very, very similar reasons. Now, what happens with these those are stages. They never emerge in a sequence that goes the other way. And if you follow this group over time, and you find that somebody gives response 2, and they change their response, it'll always be to response 3, never to response 1. So we have a sequence, we have a stage sequence. Now, those kinds of stage sequences are what you don't find in the meditative or spiritual texts anywhere around the world. So what we want to do, when we're looking at quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, is those 3 things are part of what we're taking into account. We want to take into account states because they're ever present, and they have a lot to do with the eminence issue. We're going to come back to in about 1 minute now. The stage Quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. The levels refers to the stages. We just talked about two very important types of stages. And then we come back to types, and we mentioned states as well. So of the three things that I've just briefly been discussing, states and two types of stages, where can pathology occur? In all of them. Except emptiness, because it has no moving parts and can't break. But everything else in the manifest, anything that is put together can fall apart. And anything in the manifest domain can get out of whack. And if you haven't experienced it yourself, your clients have. You have seen it all. There is not a single thing that can't get broken. Human beings are just that clever. So part of what we want to do then is we want to say, okay, now an overall view of how to help people, including ourselves, is when these pathologies can occur in states, when these pathologies can occur in stages, and what can we do about it? And that's sort of part of what we end up talking about. And so we can come back to that in a little bit. Now, incidentally, in transformations of consciousness, I looked at the types of stages in the self that are the second type we discussed, the intersubjective ones that are researched by Western psychologists in particular. But keep in mind that these things, they all sort of run together. They're not going to be radically separated because we're still dealing with a human being who's going through going through these things. So whether even the Kohlberg stages of moral development, even if they're not exactly researched just the way Kohlberg or Gilligan did in the meditative texts, you can still find certain kinds of unfoldings that are similar. But we really want to look at both of those two kinds of stages and include those because they're very, very important in an overall model. And like I say, for identifying pathology, and also just for, if y'all did work on memes, for example, on sort of identifying these and stuff, one of the important areas for that's the second type of stage we're talking about. You can sit on your meditation mat forever and you will never be able to identify or spot those unless somebody points them out first based on this other research. But one of the reasons knowing those levels of values, for example, is knowing where your client is and what language you want to use to talk to them in skillful communication. And that's very, very important. Whether the person's going to actually undergo transformation or not, you have to know what wavelength they're on so you can attune your broadcast to the same wavelength they're on, or they're not going to hear what you're saying. The therapeutic alliance depends upon aligning these wavelengths. That's part of skillful means in any event. And then looking at pathologies as well. We're talking about both eminence and transcendence, sort of how can I both transcend and be present and be eminent. And sometimes we talk about the four different moves in evolution, and horizontally we talk about agency and communion, and then vertically there's eros and agape. And eros is always reaching up for higher unions, and agape is reaching down and embracing. So eros is transcending and agape is including. So it's transcend and include. And then agency is the relative autonomy that every entity has at every stage of growth. And communion is the necessary relationship that all agents are in at every stage. And you can get something basically go wrong with either one of those. And you do get a kind of pathology, a kind of dysfunction when that happens. And so, and it does tend to be the case, so we can talk about this a little bit separately, that men and women tend to line up a little bit differently on these things. Men tend to have a little bit more eros, a little bit more agency, and women a little more agape, a little bit more communion. So and that just means the masculine and feminine principle in any of us. But that is important when you're doing therapeutic relationship, because sometimes what a man needs is to be more in touch with communion, and a woman needs to be more in touch with her autonomy, that kind of thing. And, you all are very familiar, you play this out many, many times. But the transcendence eminence is what's really extraordinary, because it is, again, that paradox. You have to, in a sense, be able to stand back from it, but also embrace it. And if you do one or the other, you get in trouble. And so if you're merely embracing something, then it's all, you're attached, you're almost addicted, you're in fusion with it. You can't let go of it. And that has its own problems. If you're, on the other hand, merely transcending, then you can be very dissociative. And that's also a very, very, it's a very common problem. A little bit more, men have it a little bit more, but it can strike everybody. And so it's always this balance. And again, it's that same strange phase-specific phenomena, where first you have to really identify with something and embrace it, and then you're allowed to let go of it. You're not allowed to short-circuit that process. And part of the problem when some of the transcendental techniques came in is that people used it to bypass the embrace part. And so it had a very hyper-masculine, straight for the sky, I don't need to do any of this stuff, I don't have to touch any of this stuff. And so you get these, spiritual erections going straight up into the heavens, yeah. Part of my favorite day, actually, but that's that's between me and my therapist. No, that's occupational hazard of the Y chromosome I'm out of here. You can actually look at the detailed, if we use in transformations of consciousness, we sort of took just 9 major levels of development. Again, you can subdivide development almost any number of ways, literally thousands of ways to do it. But we used 9 major ones that talked about the pathologies that can occur at each of those. And it's the same kind of thing, whether we use 7 chakras or 9 or 20. Development, starting in infancy, is you move up to a particular stage and you really have to identify with that stage. You have to digest it. You have to make it your own. It has to actually become part of you. So if you're at the oral stage, I'll just use some of the simple analytic terms, that means that you have to come to terms with food. And it means that you have to actually make a part of it, and you do it, and that's it. And all of a sudden your whole world is food for a while, and that's wonderful, and you're at your mother's breast, and it's fantastic. Sooner or later, though, other higher impulses start to emerge for many people. And they... two ways that can go wrong. One is you can repress that oral impulse, seal it off. The other is you can remain fixated to it in fusion. And that's true at every stage. So if it all goes healthy, you let go of it because you've already had an eminence. You've already had an agape. You've already embraced it. And therefore you can move up with eros, transcend it, and include it in an ideal world. And then you get to the next stage, and there, in this case, let's say since we're using sort of Freudian, oral, anal, next phase, just let's call it genital in general, and there are erotic impulses starting to emerge. And for young boys and young girls, there are certain early erotic feelings that can emerge. They often are, sooner or later, addressed to the parent of the opposite sex, because that's what the biological drive is. And so if you're a young girl, you can start to have erotic feelings towards dad, and young boy towards mom. And so if you're a young girl and your erotic choices are towards dad, then you know that the book that's out now, it's like, there are many of these, Smart Women, Foolish Choices. You know that? Well, that's the first foolish choice the smart woman makes. She chooses a partner she can't have. And the same thing the young boy does. And that's the whole Oedipal Electra drama and so on that's been way overblown by the Freudians. But there's a little grain of truth to that. You're starting to awaken to erotic feelings. And of course there are men and women in the environment, and there are certain attractions going on there. And again, those impulses, if there's a safety about it, if it's embraced, if there's an okayness with it, that's fine, and you can actually have an eminence to it. And then you can let go and move on. But you can get in trouble in one of two ways, again, generically. You can remain fixated to it. You won't let go of it. And we all know sooner or later that that's going to come back and haunt you. And many, many therapeutic endeavors, particularly for those of you who work with depth psychology, are, okay, let's go back. It's a cliche now. Let's talk about your mother. Let's talk about your dad. But so many of those feelings start way back then. And if you haven't inhabited them fully and healthily, then you're either going to repress them or you're going to remain stuck to them. And because of that, you've split it off. Those parts of subjective consciousness, little I's, remain sealed off as little subpersonalities that want the same thing they wanted when they were 2 years old or 3 years old or whatever it is. And they won't appear now in their true form in consciousness. They appear as an it. They're alien. And now it's a symptom. Oh, the anxiety, it affects me. I don't know what it is. And all of a sudden you're not assuming responsibility for it anymore. It's been split off. Many of you know that Freud's original phrasing for ego and id, he never ever used the term ego or id. You can find that in none of Freud's writings. The ego and the id are Latin terms that James Strachey used translating Freud's German into English. Freud used pronouns, and I think this is really extraordinary. He used the I and the it. That was what he wrote. So there's only one book in English, The Problem of Lay Analysis, where you can actually read Freud the way he wrote. And so instead of saying things like, the ego is overpowered by an id impulse, whatever the fuck that means, his actual language is, the I feels overpowered by an it that's stronger. So I say, it overcame me. The desire to eat, it was stronger than I could do it. And now his summary for therapy, very famous phrase, where it was, their ego shall be. What he actually said was, where it was, their I shall become. So it's taking the it back into an I. So I can see I'm doing it. It's my impulse that I split off and turned into an alien object, it. Then it attacks me as a symptom, and I have no idea where it came from. So it's my left hand not knowing what my right hand is doing. So that's the way that's eminence and transcendence. In other words, it's a broken form of it. Because it wasn't inhabited, it was split off and dissociated. So then you move to the next stage, and you've got a couple of these little sub-personalities or symptoms, however you want to call them, split off. And they're little bitty I's. They're little bitty intentionalities. They're little bits of subjective consciousness that want what they want when they were split off at that age. They literally retain the same value structure, the same desire. And again, go home for Christmas, give it a try. So we deal with this. So that's eminence and transcendence. So what we have here is both agape and eros are not quite working out the way they should. So as you continue to grow, most people remarkably do fairly well. And we get, and again, I'll sort of make this part up. Let's say you have 100 pesos of consciousness when you start out. And you get through the first chakra, and 2 pesos get split off as an oral fixation. Okay, and now you got 98 pesos, and you get up to the second stage, and you got a horrible father figure, and 7 pesos get split off to that. And now you're sort of limping into stage 3, 89 pesos. By the time you get to adolescence, you've got about 68 pesos left. And unfortunately, it takes 72 for enlightenment. Oh darn. So that's where you have to go back and go, I want more money in my bank. That's what therapy's about. If the depth part of therapy, and we'll talk about, there are lots of other kinds, but the depth part is going back and reclaiming those portions of consciousness that were split off, denied, alienated, all displaced, all of the hierarchy of defenses that are designed to let you convert an I into an it and no longer own it. And so under those circumstances, in a sense what therapy is taking those that are split off and bringing eminence back to them. In other words, agape. I have to go back and re-love those portions. I have to befriend those portions. I have to take them back. I have to touch them with some sort of acceptance and care. And once I do that, I can let go of them. It's that phase-specific thing. So once I have agape and embrace it, then I can let go with eros and move up. And guess what? It's moving up with me then. You've actually released the 3-year-old. And it can then rise up to wherever you are at that moment, which for most of us is at least 7 or 8 years old. So, on a good day, yeah. But so it is that, and it's a very interesting thing. Once you introduce a vertical dimension, you get that phase specificity of you have to identify, then disidentify. Then identify with the next higher stage, then disidentify. Then identify, then disidentify. And it can get very confusing because some people want to just go in and just identify. And that often ends up being very regressive. And others want to just disidentify. I'm witnessing, I'm doing vipassana, and they just dissociate. And that's not good. So it's agape and eros, eminence and transcendence. And then both of those. And part of, I think, people that make really intuitively good therapists are ones that know when a person needs to touch something and when they need to let go of it. And you can just feel it sometimes. You can go, wait a minute, you really need to get in touch with that anger. And other times you say, okay, you know what? I've heard it. You've been angry for 3 weeks. Stop it. And you can just get that sense of when they've had enough and when they haven't had enough. And then right as you go on up the whole sort of frontal personality, there's the final kind of even witness itself, and that you have to inhabit that, and then you have to let go of it for big mind, big heart, non-dual, one taste. And it's the same thing. You can get stuck on either side of that. You can remain just merely distancing, witnessing. And that's not really quite right. Nor do you want to merely identify with passing phenomena. And so even in the higher reaches of spiritual practice, there's this extraordinary dialectic of eros and agape. Letting go of and embracing. And if you want to think about sort of the ultimate one taste, it really is transcending everything.
What is your biggest vision? What could happen?
My biggest wish?
Vision.
Oh, vision.
With Integral Institute, your
Right.
work. So what is the best that could happen in the future?
Okay.
When you would say, okay, my work has been done.
Right. Does this include Miss February?
Or March, Miss March and April.
Integral's integral. Covered in chocolate. Yeah, I got it. Because everybody has these sort of wonderful dimensions and subpersonalities, and there are parts of me that are very, very confident of what I do, and parts of me that, like anybody else, is very insecure, and all of that can still arise in ever-present big mind. That's sort of the whole point about all of these things. So I've always been in an ambivalent situation about. I'm just not a self-promoting person. Even though I can be extremely confident about the theoretical stuff I've done, because I think I've done more homework than most people doing it. And somebody once said, a business person listening to me talk, and they said, you're very arrogant and self-effacing. And they couldn't figure out how I was kind of both, So I was very confident of the ideas, but I just don't want, I don't seek the limelight. So it's a balancing act that I have to do. One of the reasons that I have turned down, PBS specials and Bill Moyers and all that stuff is I don't want the person right now doing that. I think the ideas are really what's important. At the same time, in the real world, people are what gets focused on. So I've been willing to go out with Integral naked, and we're doing this, and that's fine. I'm okay with that, but it's a little ambivalent for me. What I'd like to see are these ideas out there, because these ideas make more room for more types of truth than any other system I know. And one of the reasons I felt comfortable with people saying, I love Aquil, we want to use Aquil this, Aquil that, is Aquil is a doorway to Plotinus and St. Teresa and Gautama Buddha and Hegel and Schelling. All of it is part of that. So it's not like it's deconstruction, that Derrida dreamt up in a really bad acid trip or something and forced people to memorize. It's actually components that human beings have. And the framework really is standing on the shoulders of 10,000 giants. And so I feel very comfortable about that. And if the whole United Nations woke up tomorrow and said, we're going to do an Aquil thing, I'd go, way to go. And they say, we want you to be president. And I'd go, get real. I don't get out much, and it takes more than 4 mitochondria to deal with Saddam Hussein on any given day. So I'm always trying to find ways that I can push the framework, but not me. And that's, it's a kind of awkward thing. My vision, which is also my wish, is that the framework itself becomes widespread, only because, and for this reason, if what any of the developmentalists are saying is true, and I believe the cumulative evidence is simply overwhelming, is that what we're calling second tier or centaur or integrative or in higher second and third tier, it's not an idea. It's an actual territory that is evolving at the frothy edge. It's territory that's getting laid down. It's a real new land that is actually there now. Now it is an independently existing ontological structure because it's getting laid down. It's getting sedimented as a cosmic memory. And so it's there now. And so there are people landing on this new continent in their own awareness. The 2 to 5%. Well, in this country alone, that's over 5 million people. And they have integral desires, but they don't know what to call them. They have integral visions. They have nobody to share them with. They have integral hunger and nobody that they can go to dinner with and have a feast of integral. And so this is just a map of the new world. It's not the new world. I did not invent the new world. It's just I've got one of the early maps. And those early maps, I always use this analogy, but remember when Columbus and everything hit this country, and they do those maps. In Florida, it's like the size of Greenland, and it stretches all the way down, and it's just all distorted. But they were like the only maps of the new world, other than, of course, the people that were living here. But if you want the map concession in Portugal, because it's like going that way, I got the map. So we have an integral map now. And all we want is for people that are already at that territory to have a map of their own potentials, because they already have them. And as you know, it's in therapy, part of what you do is you help people name what they're feeling. And so that's what this integral vision lets people do, is people that are already at these integral new territories have a map that they can find their way around better. They can express what they already know, but they can use it and they can be much more effective at the territory that they're already at. And then they can say, wait a minute, I got a much better map. Greenland isn't where New Mexico is, Ken. And I tell you that, that's fine. But that's where we are right now with these maps of this new territory. And so the vision would be that people that are already there would be able to have that. And then that is what makes it kosher. That's what makes it legitimate. We have to go right down the mainstream. We have to be able to get it in mainstream universities, in mainstream business, in mainstream education, and of course in Hollywood, where it all really counts. But we've made wonderful inroads with all of that. So hopefully that will continue.